Well, the Rings of Power is back, and it's still the worst fan fiction ever. I gotta admit, it was hard to watch the first episode because I can't see anything when I'm constantly rolling my eyes. The narrative decisions made in this episode are mind boggling. The show continues to change the story in ways that makes the events of The Lord of the Rings either impossible or nonsensical. Everyone but Elrond acts completely out of character compared to their book counterparts, and they also do things that, in context to the show's story, are so unbelievably stupid you'd be hard-pressed to call the elves the wisest of all beings. I want you to understand that the showrunners and writers had 2 years to fix the problems they caused in the first season. All the problems couldn't be fixed because many of them were part of the show's half-assed plot. However, the writing problems, the dialogue, the pacing, and the new narrative choices, those could have been fixed, but they weren't. This is more of the same, from the terrible dialogue to the inexplicable plot points to the incessant copying of the Lord of the Rings story structure and Peter Jackson's films. Ironically, the least bad thing in the episode is the thing that'll probably catch the most flack, their introduction of the good man Sauron and the scoundrel elves and men. The show opens with the crowning of Sauron at the beginning of the Second Age. He tells the orcs of his plan to unite all the races into one, and claims that when he and the orcs have achieved domination over the other races, the orcs will no longer be feared and hated, but worshipped as saviors. Now, let me get this out the way. Much of what Sauron says is actually lore accurate. Why he says it, not so much. There are going to be a bunch of people complaining about this part of his speech.
The Valar will never forgive you. Elves will never accept you.
Men will never look upon you with anything but horror and disgust. A corrupted and ignoble race worthy only to be hunted and slaughtered.
Saying things like orcs' lives matter, and those are going to be the people who've never read the books, because this bit of the speech is lore accurate. Both Morgoth and Sauron control the orcs partly by telling them that men, elves, and dwarves would fear and hate them and kill them on sight. This is in the Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales, and the History of Middle-earth books. So if you see anyone bitching about that part, they either didn't read the books, didn't pay attention to what they read, or they're lying. The same goes for anyone complaining about Sauron acting as if he just wants order. That's literally his MO. He favored order above all else, and although he wanted to be the one in charge, his initial motives were actually good, because he was in the beginning himself good. And he sided with Melkor, Morgoth, because of how Melkor put his plans into action. Don't take my word for it, take J.R.R. Tolkien's word for it. Go read Morgoth's Ring, Chapter 5, Myths Transformed, Notes on Motives in the Silmarillion, paperback edition, pages 394 to 398. I'm being pedantic about this because I know there will be people who show up in the comics who love to go, "You didn't do your research," anytime anyone disagrees with them. Well, I did, and that marks the 4th time I've read that book, which is probably 4 more times than any of them. What Sauron says in this scene is lore accurate. Why he says it definitely is not. The show changes a lot of things, the first being why Sauron is even talking to the orcs. The show makes it sound like he appeared out of nowhere to randomly help the orcs. That's not at all the case. In the books, Sauron works with Morgoth throughout the First Age, and after Morgoth's defeat, Sauron puts on a fair form and repents for his actions. But when summoned to stand before the Valar, he instead fled and didn't show up again until about 500 years later, when he thought the Valar had forgotten about Middle-earth. At that time, he worked with the Easterlings who'd already been corrupted by Morgoth. He doesn't work with the orcs until 500 years after that, when he starts to build Barad-dûr. The second change is the idea of Sauron negotiating with the orcs. That's not only something he would never do, but it's something he wouldn't need to do because the orcs were so corrupted by Morgoth that they're essentially genetically coded to fall in line with the Dark Lord, or really anyone with a greater will. This turns them into drone-like creatures who simultaneously hate being controlled that way, but also need the influence to have any sense of order or unity. Sauron wouldn't need to talk the orcs into doing anything, his power alone would make them side with him. But the show tries to present Sauron as a tragic figure, one who tried to help the orcs only to be betrayed by them. At that point, my eyes were rolled so far back in my head that I almost missed the part where the orc tries to stab him in the back, but then he catches the orc and brutally kills it. Adar is also there, and the whole time it seems like he's actually controlling the orcs with these side glances. He tells the orcs to pledge allegiance to Sauron, they do, And then Adar gets the crown to place on Sauron's head, but stabs Sauron with it instead, and the orcs treat Sauron's ass like Caesar turned up to 11. If you're wondering why the orcs would do this, you're in good company, because I don't know either. In the prologue of the first season, we saw Sauron with an army of orcs, so you'd think they knew him and would obey him. Even if he changed his form, he's still using the same name and has the same power, so why do they turn on him? If they don't know him, which undermines the prologue, why do they turn on him when his plan would put them in power? None of this makes any sense, so it's like the first season all over again. Speaking of not making any sense, when Sauron dies, Adar kicks him to make sure he's dead, and Sauron's spirit erupts and freezes the land around them, despite Sauron being associated with fire. But see, he really doesn't die, because his blood falls through all the cracks in the ground and collects in a cave, and presumably after hundreds, if not thousands of years, Sauron's goop attacks a rat and uses that stolen life to drag itself out of the cave and the mountain and down to a road where it kills a woman in a wagon, and then Sauron takes on his new form of Discount Aragorn. Now, it is true that any Maya taking on a living form can be killed in that form, but that would only strip them of that body. Their spirit would be fine, and depending on their power, they could take on a new form again. So to have Sauron turn into a puddle of blood doesn't make any sense, and neither does him killing other things to take on a new form, and there's no attempt to explain why this would even happen. Oh, but then it gets nuttier, because then Halbrand, Discount Aragorn, randomly bumps into some people fleeing an orc attack, and he meets an old man who has the crest he later uses to claim that he's the heir to this kingdom, but the old man's family were actually the servants of the real king's family, and he keeps it as a reminder. Now, apparently Halbrand wants to kill himself after just resurrecting, but the old man convinces him to join his group leaving on a boat, which then gets attacked by a sea monster, and Halbrand steals the crest from the man when the dude gets trapped under a beam, and this connects to the scene when Strong Woman spots the remains of the boat when her dumbass tries to swim across an ocean to get back to Middle-earth. So, to recap, Sauron goes full J.D. Vance and then gets shanked for being so weird, settles in a pool of his own blood for a couple hundred years, then springs back to life, killing creatures to get a new form, only to decide to try to kill himself once he's human, but then changes his mind when he talks to the old man, but then backstabs the old man, and then teams up with Strong Woman, seemingly to get revenge on the orcs and Adar who backstabbed him, without ever telling anyone why he's doing this shit. This is the first 15 minutes of the show, and this is the best part of the episode, and it doesn't make a lick of sense. This fool dragged himself out of a mountain where he was dying just so he could die again and then randomly changes his mind? Now, this is where someone will say that maybe he was looking for the orcs, which is fair, but we don't see that, and he doesn't say that, so how do we know that? What he says is that he's seeking death, so there's a problem, because he was already dead, so why did he come back to life? Speaking of problems, you remember how in the Fellowship movie Arwen got chased by the ring wraiths? You remember how cool that was? Now imagine that instead of 9 riders chasing down smoking hot Liv Tyler, it's just Strong Woman chasing down Elrond, literally trying to grab his sack. And that's just a very unfortunate double entendre, and it will not be the last. Also, that's actually not the problem with this scene. The problem with the scene is that we have no idea why she's chasing him. I have a pretty good memory, but I couldn't remember anything from the last episode of Season 1 that had Elrond take the rings and try to keep them from anyone. So I checked the episode, and the last we see of Elrond and Strong Woman is her smiling about the rings and him looking dour now that he knows that Halbrand isn't what he claimed to be, but there's nothing about Elrond taking the rings, so why is he running away with them? How did he even get them? There's a story beat that's missing, which happens a few more times in this episode, and it was a recurring problem in the first season too. We need context for why characters do things. It seems like the writer for the episode decided to invert the explanation, so we get the reason for Elrond taking the rings after he's already taken them, but before he knows the reason. The rings were crafted by Sauron. So the way this goes down is Elrond races to tell Gil-galad about Halbrand, and he has the rings for some reason. Strong Woman tries to chase him down but fails, so Elrond reaches the High King first. Strong Woman then admits to the king that Halbrand is Sauron, which pisses off Gil-galad, who never believed Strong Woman's claim that Sauron was alive anyway, so his anger makes no sense. Now I'm going to have to correct myself because I said in previous videos that everyone knew that Halbrand was Sauron, but that's not true. Strong Woman only told them that Halbrand was not who he claimed to be and not to trust him. She never told Elrond or Celebrimbor that Halbrand was Sauron, so 1, my mistake, and 2, why does Elrond take the rings? He doesn't know there's anything wrong with them. As far as he knows, the rings can still help heal the tree that's somehow tied to elves' immortality in Middle-earth, which also doesn't make a lick of sense, but I'll get to that later. So now that Elrond knows the rings were created with Sauron's scrap, he refuses to hand them over to the king because he doesn't know what control Sauron might have over them, even though Strong Woman says Sauron never touched them. And this is the biggest problem in the show. Elrond is so obviously right that it makes Gil-galad and Strong Woman look dumb and dumber to want to use the rings. This massive issue only happens because the showrunners decided to invert the order in which the rings were created. In the book, the 7 and the 9 were created first with Sauron's help, while Celebrimbor makes the 3 on his own. This is how the elves know for sure that Sauron has no direct power over the 3. But by reversing the order of creation, the elves now have no way to know what, if any, control Sauron has over the rings because they have no point of reference. There are no other rings of power. Why would anyone put on these rings when the enemy could control them? This is probably why this show has this nonsense about the trees being tied to the elves' immortality. If the tree's light fades and the elves can no longer stay in Middle-earth, then they will leave the men and dwarfs to the machinations of Sauron while the elves flee back to Valinor. The only way for the elves to stay and fight is using the 3 rings to restore the light of the tree, granting them immortality in Middle-earth again. And I guess that works in a kind of backwards logic. Of course, that begs the question of why we never hear anything about this damn tree in the Lord of the Rings. It would be the first thing Sauron would destroy because it'd get rid of the elves, but it never comes up. Remember, the Rings of Power is supposed to connect to the Lord of the Rings, so that's a major change that breaks the story because all of the elven cities on the west coast are more or less abandoned by the Third Age. So what happened to the tree? Did they just leave it? Did they take it somewhere else? And how does this fading light affect half-elves like Elrond? Does he half die? Since half-elves have the gift to choose mortality, should he choose a mortal life, does his light go back to the tree? All of this nonsense could have been avoided by telling the story in the proper order. There was no reason to change it. The change doesn't even add anything to the story, it doesn't fit with the lore at all, and is so convoluted that the show can barely explain it. Anyway, Gil-galad wants the rings to save the tree, but Elrond won't give him up and jumps into the waterfall to get away. He somehow survives this, which would be surprising if half the cast hadn't survived the volcanic eruption at point-blank range in the last season. Meanwhile, Halbrand has somehow wound up as a prisoner of the orcs, still claiming to be a king, which is strange because the last time we saw him, he was smiling with Mount Doom in the background. How did he end up with these people, and why is he in chains? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone from the show want to explain what happened? And while you're at it, would you like to explain how much time has passed between the last episode and this one, just for reference? No? What? I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Say it again. This isn't that kind of show. Got it. So he's in chains and gets taken in front of Adar, claiming that he will help Adar find Sauron if Adar frees his people. So you then went from Caesar to Moses. You gonna do Jesus next? That's a rhetorical question. I've already seen the clips. The answer is yes. Anyway, I think Adar suspects that Halbrand might be Sauron, but it's not clear. Either way, Adar orders his men to torture Halbrand before later coming to talk to him to tell him the story about how Adar and the other Moriandor, the Sons of the Dark, came into being. They were promised power by Morgoth and locked away on the cliff to starve. Eventually, Sauron brought Adar wine, and it's implied that this is the wine that changed Adar, which is why he hates Sauron. This is fine. It does borrow from pieces of Silmarillion, but it works. It's just buried midway in the episode between the convoluted plot about the rings and Gandalf and the Hobbit wandering around in the desert eating bugs. But there's another moment that works in the scene when Halbrand pledges his allegiance to Adar, but instead of saying Adar, he says the Dark Lord, and then smirks because he's the Dark Lord. We also see in the scene that he uses his power to control a warg that later attacks the man torturing him. In short, we see Sauron being evil, but with the implication that he's just getting revenge against Adar. The show tries to make Sauron a tragic villain, and I don't know why they did this with Sauron when they already have the character Adar to use for that concept, and it works better with him because he's a corrupted elf, whereas Sauron is a burgeoning Dark Lord. But then again, I've got this nasty habit of wanting things to make sense, so of course I would find it weird for the greatest evildoer in the land to be treated as a tragic victim of circumstances. Speaking of tragic circumstances, let's talk about totally not Gandalf and his damn Hobbit, because their scenes kill the already glacial pace of this show. If before the show moved like molasses, these scenes make it move like glass. The first scene was barely 7 minutes long. I swear it felt like 20 minutes. And what do we get for our struggle? A bunch of clunky dialogue either borrowed from the Lord of the Rings book and film, or trying and failing to sound like it came from Tolkien. I just watched Kung Fu Panda 4, and part of the story was Poe trying to come up with wise sayings. That's what this scene was like, but slower and not entertaining. And all this just to establish that the mystery man is having wet dreams about grabbing his staff and things erupt him when he does. I told you that there would be more unfortunate double entendres. Nori asks him about it, but that's not the kind of thing you share with a young lady. He also tries to use his powers to make a tree grow because they need food, but he can't control it and destroys the tree, but calls up some bugs for him and Nori to eat. Off in the distance, he sees a light and realizes they're being followed. We all know who this is, but they don't, so later they set a trap to catch the person, and it turns out to be Poppy, who followed them this whole time, and they never noticed. On the plus side, she brings food and a map and a hint of how to find the right way. Apparently, the hobbits came from this direction, and their walking song tells them how to find their way through the desert. Of course, Poppy isn't the only one following them. One of Xerxes' minions from 300 spies on them the whole time. I mean, why steal from Peter Jackson when you can also crib from Zack Snyder? The rest of the episode is about the elves finding Elrond. He goes to the Grey Havens to speak to Círdan the shipwright, who Elrond convinces to destroy the rings. Círdan won't even look at the rings and just takes Elrond's word that they're dangerous and decides to toss them into a chasm in the sea, which might be a reference to Moglor throwing one of the Silmarils into the sea. But when Círdan tries to throw it into the water, something bubbles up and the rings fall back into his boat. He finally opens the pouch and sees the rings and changes his mind. Meanwhile, Strong Woman arrives with Gil-galad and tries to talk Elrond into giving her the rings, but Círdan already has them. Because of this, the group goes back to the tree, and Gil-galad sings a sad song about the last leaves falling from the tree, or more like Tolkien weeping in his grave, and then Círdan shows up with the rings, wearing Narya, the Ring of Fire, and gives the other two, Vilya, the Ring of Air, and Ninya, the Ring of Water, to Gil-galad, but Elrond shouts for the king not to put them on, causing Gil-galad to drop them. Ninya bounces to Strong Woman, who puts it on, and suddenly the tree springs back to life, glowing with golden light as if it were a small version of Laurelin, one of the two trees of Valinor. Now, if you hear some shuffling, don't worry, that's just Tolkien spinning in his grave. You're going to hear that a lot in this show, so get used to it. Everything about this is wrong. The idea that the elves need some tree to survive is wrong. That they need a Silmaril to fix it is wrong. That the Silmaril is a source of Mithril is wrong. That the three rings are made of an alloy of Mithril, meaning they're part Silmaril, is wrong. And that putting on the rings instantly fixes the tree that's not even connected to the rings, and the elves don't even do anything, is wrong. And all that's before we talk about how all the elves, the most beautiful beings in Middle-earth, look like regular people pulled off the street. Elrond's face sums it up. How did it come to this? I don't understand. Genuinely, I don't understand how anyone reads Tolkien's books and then envisions anything like this scene or anything that happens in the show. The Rings of Power is from a completely different world. It isn't even in the same vein as Tolkien's elves being silly and goofy in The Hobbit, and a little silly in The Lord of the Rings, but super serious in The Silmarillion. Nothing from the Rings of Power connects to Tolkien's world. It's just using names and locations and ideas from Tolkien's works, but if you watch this show and then read The Lord of the Rings or watch the films, you'd swear you missed something because it just doesn't connect. And then you get this crazy ending to the episode where Halbrand shows up at Celebrimbor's forge, and Celebrimbor lets him in, even though it's only been a few days, maybe a few weeks, since Strong Woman told Celebrimbor that Halbrand is a fraud, don't trust him. Mind you, Gil-galad sends a message to Celebrimbor that Halbrand is Sauron, but because the show makes no attempt to tell you about distance or time, it's not clear whether that message should have gotten there by now. Why in the world would he let this guy in after the events of the first season? In the book, it makes sense that Celebrimbor works with Annatar because no one knows who Annatar is, and even though Galadriel doesn't trust him, the other elves have no tangible reason to agree with her. In the Rings of Power, Celebrimbor already knows the dude lied about his identity and ran away. Why does he let Halbrand in? It makes no sense why he would ignore Strong Woman's warning. Besides that she's the dumbest woman in the world because she didn't realize she was standing next to the guy she's been hunting for centuries. And that's how the episode ends, with this set of inexplicable situations that come across like the worst fan fiction ever. I will give the show some credit. The VFX are better than the first season. The set design for the Sauron and Adar scenes were perfect. The orcs look awesome. That said, the elven sets still look like sets, and I think that's because of how they're lit and the color grading done on the shots. I think more contrast and less saturation might make the elven scenes feel more realistic. But when it comes to the story, the reason why anyone watches a show? Yeah, it's bad. On the plus side, it's not worse than the first season, but on the bad side, it's more of the same. It's like no one on the show learned from their mistakes, so they're just making them all over again. And I suspect that it'll get the same result. They'll lose most of their audience by mid-season. That might be why Amazon released 3 episodes up front. That gives them some coverage before the numbers fall off. But if that's the game they're playing, that doesn't bode well for the season or the series as a whole. It's always a strange choice for people to take something beloved by a large audience and then fundamentally change it and expect that fans will love the new take. I think damn near everyone loves the band Earth, Wind & Fire. I know everybody loves the song September. So when the world's current mega pop star Taylor Swift decided to cover that song, I don't think anyone expected to get her Panera Bread rendition, and nobody liked it. Everything about her cover was the wrong choice to make, and the same goes for the Rings of Power. All the changes made in the show make it harder to tie the show back to the events that lead to the Lord of the Rings. That undermines the appeal of the show because it comes across as fan fiction instead of an adaptation of the story. It doesn't feel like Tolkien's world. You can change a lot of things, like Peter Jackson did, but still make it feel like it belongs in Middle-earth. I think the War of the Rohirrim film will play out this way. It'll be canonically incorrect, but still feel like it's part of or could have happened in Tolkien's world. Hell, even the Shadow of Mordor games managed that, and they're wildly off. I'm not interested in Amazon's fanfiction. I'm interested in seeing Tolkien's works brought to life. The more you deviate from his works, the less I'm invested in your story, even if it's good, because I'm not just here for your take, I'm here for him. And when it seems like you have no respect for what he did, and no respect for his work, I have no patience for yours. I'm willing to accept some changes because that's the nature of adaptation, but the core story and characters shouldn't be unrecognizable, and that's unfortunately what we get with the Rings of Power. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.